This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today to have two guests. The first is Reid Locklin, and he is Associate Professor of Christianity in the Intellectual Tradition at the University of Toronto, a joint appointment with St. Michael's College in the Department for the Study of Religion. His research focuses on a range of issues in comparative theology and Hindu Christian studies, particularly the engagement between Christian thought and the Hindu tradition of Advaita Vedanta. He also writes on the scholarship of teaching and learning in theology and religion. And in this podcast today, we're going to be discussing his book, Hindu Mission, Christian Mission, Soundings in Comparative Theology, published by State University of New York from 2024. Reid, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we have a returning guest who has the distinction of appearing in an episode that has the most number of views, over 22,000, at the Multi-Faith Matters podcast, Fred Stella. Fred, welcome.
Thank you very much, John.
You can find these gentlemen's bios in the podcast notes, but let me introduce Fred for those who don't know him. Fred is an accomplished lecturer on many aspects of Hinduism and has presented at conferences across the United States and internationally. He has completed extensive lecture tours in India and Guyana. Mr. Stella is a product of 16 years, including College of Roman Catholic education. He is uniquely qualified to explain the Dharma to those in Abrahamic traditions in a most understandable way. Fred is ordained as an outreach minister. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the word there, by his local temple, and he serves as a member of the National Leadership Council of the Hindu American Foundation, an advocacy group organization based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, again, thank you for coming here.
My pleasure.
My colleague at the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy made me aware of this great book that you've got, Reid. So I thought it would be good to have this conversation to tease out for listeners and viewers what the book is about, but also to bring in a Hindu voice and have a conversation about that. I thought it would be important. So let's begin by unpacking the book. Reid, how did this come about? How does a Catholic, you're a Catholic, can you tell us about your background that you're bringing to it and how this came about?
Sure. I mean, there's a long and a short version of that. So the long version would include why I sort of study Hinduism. And if that's relevant, I can sort of talk about that later. I am a convert to Catholicism, and my encounter with Hinduism was part of that story. But in terms of the immediate sort of genesis of the book, so I determined for a variety of reasons to study, do my PhD work with a Jesuit scholar named Francis Clooney, who at that time taught at Boston College, but now is at Harvard University. And his field of study is Hindu Christian studies. And he's sort of pioneered a new way of thinking about the encounter of religions, which he called comparative theology, thinking it was original, but it turns out there's actually a long and kind of colonialist, kind of ugly history to that term. So we've had to deal with that. So I was trained as a comparative theologian. And one of the things that you do when you're working on your PhD is you do primary source research. And so being somebody who's not trained as an Indologist, who has, mediocre at best Sanskrit language abilities, I've spent a lot of time with Sanskrit, but I'm not a great linguist. There are different ways you gain expertise. And one of the things that I thought is, as a Catholic who came from a tradition that talks about tradition in a robust way, that says, you don't really know Catholic tradition unless you encounter it through teachers in the tradition. I said, well, why would I study Hinduism any differently? So I wrote to an Advaitin teacher in Chennai in India, and I went and studied there for about 6 months, which people sometimes are like, well, that's a long time. And I was like, in terms of the amount of time you're supposed to study Advaita Vedanta, it's nothing. It's like that. Right. So I'm very much an amateur in that respect as well. And while I was there, it was 1999 to 2000. And while I was there, Pope John Paul II came and visited India. And Swami Dayananda Saraswati, there's two Dayananda Saraswati. One is an 18th century figure, and one is the contemporary who's recently passed away. So it was the modern, the contemporary Dayananda Saraswati, who was alive at that time, who was connected to the parampara that I was studying in. He wrote an open letter to John Paul II. And the title of the letter was Conversion is Violence. And in that letter, he makes a categorical distinction between missionary and non-missionary religions, converting and non-converting traditions. And Hinduism is a non-converting tradition, non-missionary tradition. And Christianity is a converting missionary tradition. Because conversion is violence, that means Christianity is a violent tradition. And so he made this sort of categorical distinction, and I've learned since then, of course, that's actually a distinction that Christian missionaries originally made, not the violence piece, but the missionary versus non-missionary. And I remember talking to my guru and saying, that seems too simple. Like, it seems to me that there's something about outreach, there's something about, dare I say, conversion in this text that I'm studying from the 8th century by Adi Shankaracharya. And he sent me, I should have actually had it here, he sent me to get a book, which I don't have on my shelf right now, but it's a book from the Chinmaya mission called Shankara the Missionary. And so he said, go read that book. So I went and read it. I wrote my dissertation on the text I was studying. I didn't sort of return to this question, but it was a question that lingered. Is it that simple to think of this as sort of as a binary, as there are these missionary traditions and there are these non-missionary traditions? And then it sort of haunted me for a while. So I finished what I had to finish my PhD. I eventually published that in a couple different publications. And then I said, well, I'm going to look at this. So then I wrote this book, which is Hindu Mission, Christian Mission. And what it is, in essence, is a study of 5 traditions associated with the Advaita Vedanta tradition. So the Ramakrishna mission, the Chinmaya mission, which is sort of the genesis of my interest in this, and it's the one I spent the most time on. The tradition of Ramana Maharshi, the Transcendental Meditation movement, and then the affiliates of the Sringeri Mutt, which is a very traditional sort of center of Advaita. And I look at these movements as missionary movements. And I say, if we look at them as missionary movements, what do we learn about mission? And I wasn't sort of coming out against this distinction that Dayananda made. Instead, I was trying to do what academics do, which is to complicate it, to say, it depends what you mean by mission, right? And there are ways in which what Dayananda said in that open letter are true. And I argue there are ways in which what Dayananda said in that letter are not true. And so for me, the best way to do that was to look at some specific examples, which were those 5 movements. So maybe I'll stop there. I can talk more about sort of insights that I had along the way, but that's the project in a nutshell.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. Now, you mentioned this idea, these parallel narratives of the conversion debate between Hindus and Christians. And I've encountered that in years past. In prior years, I was one of the editors of Sacred Tribes Journal, and I came across this idea of predatory proselytism, the concern that many Hindus have. And so we brought a Christian who'd been working in India and some Hindus together, and we had them discuss it in the pages of the magazine. But for those who aren't familiar with that very popular narrative that's out there, can you summarize that? And then what I love about what you're doing with the book is you're contrasting it with an alternative way of what you call imagining dialogical possibilities.
Yeah. So, I think that a lot of debates in India throughout the world are consequences of colonialism, right? And the Portuguese and then British colonial occupations of India are real. They were damaging, and they have long legacies. And so one of the legacies of that has to do with the ways that Christianity is perceived as having arrived on the shores of India. And one of the things that I suspect will have come up in your discussion is that Christianity actually has a really long history in India. There were Christians in India longer than there were Christians in most parts of Europe. Nevertheless, the Portuguese in particular brought a particular vision of Christianity that was forged in the so-called Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. And that was a particularly, some may say, conquest-driven vision of Christianity. And so I think that what you have is this moment when Christianity presents what I would argue is one of the most violent faces of Christianity, with the arrival of the Portuguese in Goa. And the experience in Goa was quite traumatic, right? So, and it was most traumatic, I should say, not just in Goa, but in the west coast of India. It was actually very traumatic to the Christians that were already there as well, right? So, because the Portuguese didn't recognize their form of Christianity. And so that sort of colored the whole narrative, I think. The British relationship with Christianity is actually, especially the British East India Company, is more complicated. But eventually, by about the late 19th century, the British are all into sort of evangelizing India. And so I think the conversion controversy comes out of that. And the terms of the conversion controversy are at one level pretty simple. The idea is that Christianity, is a tradition that is advanced through conquest, and that gains converts through, in many cases, illicit means, which can include violence, but it can include sort of promises of healthcare and economic mobility, and that can become a threat to other traditions, but also in the case of India, to Indian sovereignty, right? To the idea that India has this long and wonderful tradition of Hinduism, and that is connected to the nation state when it achieves independence in 1947, connected in a complex way. I mean, India is also a secular state that honors pluralism, but nobody would say that Hinduism is not a deep part of that movement, right? And so the conversion controversy is basically a controversy about what constitutes legitimate conversion into Christianity, whether conversions are sincere, whether that's a threat to Indian nationhood, and whether whether restrictions should be placed on it. And so there's a whole bunch of so-called freedom of religion legislation that has passed in various states, not nationwide, but in various states in India, that sort of require converts to report to the police if they're converting, and there are sort of rules around that. It's connected to all kinds of things. It gets connected to scheduled castes and tribes and the reservation system in terms of parliament and parliamentary power. So it's a political issue. It's a social issue. It has to do with economic and racialized divisions in India, just like we have in North America, right? So it touches many different things. So my contribution to that is to say, let's if instead of saying that there's sort of predatory Christians on this side, and let me just say that there's no question that Christians have sometimes been predatory, right? I mean, I think that one of the things I try to do in the book is to be very honest about Christian history. Right? There are reasons why there's this perception of Christianity in India, and those reasons are not crazy, right? But particularly the way that some Christian traditions, and I talk about Catholicism and so I call it mainline ecumenical Christianity, so the Christianity that's associated with the World Council of Churches, for example, that Christianity has changed a lot in the 20th century. So if we look at that Christianity, and then we also take a more complex view of Hinduism, then it turns out we don't have a binary. What we have are different ways of thinking about mission that then the imaginative possibility is that then they can interact with each other in interesting ways, right? And so a lot of the project of the book is to say that, what if Christianity looked more like these Hindu mission movements? What if we thought about mission in a way that is more like these movements rather than some of the legacies that we carry? And I think that that's possible, and it's possible partly because Christianity is complex and there are traditions that resonate with these Hindu traditions that already exist, right? So I don't know, that was kind of a long... The problem with writing a big book is that you have all these sort of historical background to these questions, then you end up bringing, the whole thing ends up coming into any particular answer.
Oh, that's all right. I appreciate that. Fred, you've been listening for a little bit. Reid's a Catholic theologian who has been studying Hinduism academically and bringing this thesis. You're a former Catholic who's now a practicing Hindu. What are your initial thoughts about some of what you're hearing, this conflict thesis and what he's putting forward here?
Well, my first thoughts are degrees of separation. Reid and I are separated by a very, very thin slice.
Sure.
I am currently a part of a cohort that is engaged with the dialogue that is set up and sponsored by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And as a matter of fact, our next meeting is in November in Washington, D.C. And Father Clooney is a friend and colleague. I've known Father Clooney for several years now, and we've had multiple occasions to dialogue, and I find him to be just a wonderful human being. I wasn't aware that Reid is Roman Catholic, but now hearing that and hearing his approach, it all makes sense. Reid comes from what I think is a very enlightened Roman Catholic approach. As far as his theory that yes, there are Hindu missionaries, I couldn't agree more. Of course there is, but he's also correct that you have to then define what does missionary mean.
Absolutely.
And missionary from a Christian perspective, particularly an evangelical Christian perspective, and missionary from a Hindu perspective, they are two different things. There's a lot of nuance between the two. Also, I will say that I was sponsored. Reid, are you familiar with an organization called Vivekananda Kendra?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
They sponsored me on a 4-state lecture tour. I lectured in approximately 30 different locales within the states of Assam, Meghalaya, Nagaland, and Arunachal Pradesh back in 2005. And they had a deep concern about what they considered to be the predatory nature of evangelism. And so I was there to address that. And certainly one of the reasons they wanted me on this lecture tour is because I was a non-Indian. I was kind of sort of white. I'm Italian American, so when asked to identify my ethnicity, oftentimes if I always kind of hold my nose and check white, but if there's an opportunity to check other and then write your own, I always do that and write Mediterranean gold. So but anyway, close enough to white. And one of the things I tried to do in my lecture tour was to get them to understand that there are more expressions of Christianity than they are used to seeing. Because I wanted not only for them to continue to embrace their traditional ways, and by the way, many of my audiences did not self-identify as Hindu. They identified with their tribal religion. For instance, Kashi. All right. So and then there are people, it's kind of like the Japanese with Shintoism and Buddhism, they kind of split the difference. So there were people who were of their tribal religion at home, but they also would read the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita and had a little statue of Krishna or Shiva in their home. So anyway, I wanted to make sure they understood that we're not talking about a binary issue here, and that there were Christians who wished them well on their spiritual journey. At one point, I remember I had a conversation with some people in one of the locales, and I said, next time you're on the internet, do a search for Bishop Spong. And just read what you can see. Well, there was the lecture, there was a little conversation afterwards, and then there was a dinner at someone's home. And hours later, those people with whom I had this conversation came to the home where I was to join me for dinner, and this was, again, a couple hours later. They had gone someplace, looked up the works of Spong, came to dinner,
Wow.
and they were beaming, just
Wow.
beaming, like, we had no idea there was this expression of Christianity. And I did do my very best to indicate that Roman Catholicism had changed a lot since the 16th century. You guys have, done a few things.
We've been busy.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
exactly. And I also would quote, not verbatim, but paraphrase some of the conclusions of the Second Vatican Council as in terms of how religions outside of Roman Catholicism could be viewed. So I did not, I certainly was still aware and spoke against the more predatory examples of evangelism, but I also encouraged them strongly to meet those challenges in a Gandhian way, because there was no way in the world I wanted to incite violence or even anger at this evangelical expression.
Now, Reid, I think it's important for folks to understand your book and what you're trying to do there. You're comparing Catholic and mainline ecumenical Christianity with certain strands, expressions within Hinduism, particularly as we've mentioned, Advaita Vedanta. Now, can you explain why you did that? I was happy to see in the book you're not engaging in reductionism that many times Christians do, and saying that's what Hinduism is all about. So why did you select that tradition, and what groups within that did you choose for your analysis?
For sure. And I should say that if I wanted to have an easy case of kind of an evangelical form of Hinduism, the first place to go is ISKCON, or the Hare Krishna movement, which is a Vaishnava movement, which has a complex history. I have many friends in ISKCON. I love the ISKCON movement. So one of the reasons I study Advaita is because it's the tradition that I know, right? So part of it is just, I spent time with this tradition. The texts that I studied were Advaita texts. The parampara that I studied in was an Advaita parampara, and to a certain extent, that was just accidental. Those were the people that were willing to receive me as a student at that time. So there have been some helpful ways to think about the complexity of Hinduism, and I don't know, Fred, what you think of this. When I try to explain to people the complexity of Hindu tradition, usually what I say is that if you took every form of Judaism, every form of Christianity, every form of Islam, and every form of Marxism, and put them together and called it Messianism, and you said that's a religion, that's how I sort of try to characterize the complexity of Hinduism. Hinduism is a vast ocean, and almost any kind of variation, any kind of complex with questions of theism, any kind of theism you can imagine is there in Hinduism somewhere.
100%. Yes.
Yeah.
It is. When I give introductory lectures, I host a lot of groups, non-Hindu groups at our local temple. I'm in charge of the tour group. And I always give an introductory lecture, and I say something similar to what you just said. And in a similar way, that if either one of you gentlemen were asked to give a lecture on Christianity to a group of non-Christians who knew virtually nothing, it would behoove both of you to say, well, this is the expression that I belong to, but to make this an honest experience, I also have to tell you about the other traditions.
Right.
So,
yes. Oh, sorry. And I mean, beautiful. Sorry, please. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Real quick, you mentioned the Hare Krishnas, a perfect example of the exception that proves the rule.
Right.
So my very first connection outside of a book with Hinduism was the Hare Krishna movement in 1970. They were the only temple. There were other expressions of Hindu Dharma in Detroit, which is where I'm from, But in 1970, they were the only temple. And so they were my introduction. I was never a member of the Hare Krishna movement. And hittingly, lovingly, when I give my lectures and I am asked about the Hare Krishnas, especially when I talk about its non-evangelical ethos. And somebody says, well, what about the Hare Krishnas? I remember them in the airports and all this back in the 1960s. And I say, well, yeah, I said, they're kind of like our Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay. However, they really have reformed. Really.
Yeah, there's a really complex history there.
Yes.
But even from the origins, and Jehovah's Witnesses are a pretty good example. Like Jehovah's Witnesses, they show up at your door like frequently. I love the Jehovah's Witnesses. They always try. I'm a Catholic, so I'm outside the fold, right? And but we have wonderful conversations, and I think one of the things that's so beautiful about the Jehovah's Witnesses and the ISKCON is that they really try to evangelize through joy.
Yes.
Like we were just in Germany, and there were Hare Krishna singing in the square, and I was like, they're evangelizing by singing in the square.
Yep.
Right, and to say this. Again, ISKCON has undergone some really huge changes, including rapid growth in India.
Yes.
But I want to say that one of the things that I think has been core throughout, and this goes back to the Gaudiya Vaishnava, roots of the tradition, is this idea that you don't have to force people to do things. If what you're teaching is good, if you manifest that joy, it'll be attractive, right? Like that'll draw people, and I think that Christianity at its best, not always at its best, maybe it's not even usually at its best, but I think Christianity at its best manifests that. I think the Hare Krishnas throughout, there's some really grim chapters, even in that short history of this kind of movement. They're very candid about that, and they faced it. And they're actually producing a lot of theologians now. They're a really interesting movement. Okay, but we could talk about the Hare Krishnas. I'm not an expert in the Hare Krishnas. Most of my knowledge of Hare Krishnas is just these lovely people that I know.
In here.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to they're opening a temple here. I'm speaking from Grand Rapids, which is away from Detroit. They're opening a temple here, and I'm going to the soft opening. I'm not sure what that means. I know what it means for a restaurant. I don't know what it means for a temple. Regardless, they're having their soft opening locally on Janmashtami Eve, which is Sunday. So
sure.
Anyway,
Grand Rapids is because of the heart of Calvinism, one of the big hearts of Calvinism in North America. So, so in terms of why I studied the traditions I did, so part of it is just expertise. But when we talk about that vast ocean of Hinduism, there are different ways of dividing it up, right? And one of the things would be by sampradaya, by teaching tradition. Now, not all Hindu traditions are teaching traditions in that sense, but many of them are. And so Advaita Vedanta is a recognizable teaching tradition. So most forms of Hinduism have some strain of non-dualism in them, although not all do, but most do. But the Advaitins are the ones who are, I would say, non-dualist in a doctrinaire sense, right? So they say, what is liberation? Liberation is knowing that your innermost self is not different from the innermost reality of God, in a nutshell. And that's liberation. And anything else is just a way to kind of approach that. So there's the doctrinal piece, but then there's also Raymond Brady Williams was one of the first sort of Western scholars to look at diaspora or transnational Hinduism in North America. He focused really on the Swaminarayan tradition. It was interesting. He was a New Testament scholar who just fell in love with the Swaminarayans and then wrote all kinds of stuff about them and became a kind of anthropologist. He has a typology of different patterns of formation in North America of Hindu traditions. Let's talk about two of them. One is the sort of ecumenical temple tradition, where sort of some temples in North America are unlike anything you'd encounter in India, where you'd have a really significant murti of Vishnu and a really significant murti of Shiva, for example. It would be unusual. It would be very common to have both in a Hindu temple in India, but not both given the same prominence. They're usually not facing each other. They're usually facing in different directions. But that's an ecumenical temple tradition. So it's the tradition that's supposed to, when you have a diverse Hindu community in a city like Toronto, those are the first temples that were formed in many cases because many different Hindus would be comfortable in that temple. The other tradition that took shape in North America pretty quickly was what in one of his writings he called it sectarian Hinduism, but in another one he called it guru Hinduism, which is a form of Hinduism that's really much more like what I in Catholic tradition will call an ecclesial movement. It's founded on a charism of a leader. And so the movements that I study are in both those boxes. So they're Advaita Vedanta movements, although none of them are exclusively Advaita Vedanta. There's an interesting, you start out, things you learn as you write, is that I was like, well, looking at all of these just as Advaita movements is kind of reductive because all of them are more complex than that. But they're all also guru movements. So there are movements that are associated with a guru, a teacher, and not primarily in temples, although they in many cases have temples, but they're not primarily temple traditions. They're not Sanatanist traditions, for example. And so I looked at that box. It's a small box, not to say this is all of Hinduism, but to say this is a useful box. And one of the reasons is because I just happen to know that tradition. But the other big tradition, I happen to have this book by Chinmayananda that like, provoked the whole thing. But the other reason to do it is because oftentimes when people talk about missionary Hinduism, they say the first Hindu missionary was Swami Vivekananda, who founded the Ramakrishna mission. Now, that's probably not true. It's probably true that the first missionary was a Brahmo Samaji. Another kind of reformist Hindu tradition. But in terms of the first Hindu missionary that sort of everybody looked at and saw a missionary and sort of made a kind of world-changing impact, I think it's fair to say that it was Vivekananda. So even if it's not quite true historically, I think that the received tradition that he was the first missionary is a good one.
Excuse me, Reid, are you saying that Brahmo Samaj was also first in the United States?
Yes, yeah. So there's I've lost his name. It's in the book, but one of the president of the Brahmo Samaj.
Mohan Roy?
No. It wasn't any of the people you're thinking of. It's I can find it. There was a Brahmo Samaji who was on lecture tours, oftentimes in Unitarian, the same places that Vivekananda went to, Unitarian churches and congregational churches in North America, and he was really there first. So I think that the case that if missionary means a Hindu spreading a form of Hinduism in North America, then I think the Brahmo Samajis can claim that. But in terms of making sort of a splash and, getting lots of news coverage and becoming somebody who's like the image of a Hindu missionary, it was Vivekananda. And so he is received as an Advaitin, although new historiography on him actually complexifies him as well. But certainly the movement that he founded was, at least in its outward-facing form, very much Advaitin. And so then, that there's sort of a rationale there, is to say that one of, if not the earliest form of missionary Hinduism, is in fact Advaitin. And I think there are good reasons why Advaita could spread, and that's part of what I detail in the book, is that there are ways in which Advaita, in the way that it talks about experience in some of its forms, in the way that it talks about geography and culture in some of its forms, in its engagement in, they would call it social uplift, but I would call it political mobilization. Social mobilization, and even the way that it talks about conversion, there are distinctive theological features of Advaita that, in my mind, make it, first of all, particularly amenable to a missionary kind of outreach. I think that goes back to the 8th century. I don't think it's an invention of the 20th century or the 19th century. But also make it a really interesting dialogue partner for a tradition that's comparable in some ways, which is the Catholic tradition, which is also in its own way syncretic, which is also in its own way founded in a certain kind of understanding of tradition. So they are also kind of nice dialogue partners, I think. Yeah.
If I may,
yeah,
it is interesting in the Brahmo Samaj movement, in the Vedanta Society, Ramakrishna mission, the Vivekananda movement, and in the movement that I embraced, of Paramhansa Yogananda, who came several years after Vivekananda in 1920. The people who embraced this theology, very few of them, if any, self-identified as Hindu, correct?
Right. Yes, that's true. Yeah. So there was a kind of, and I know people who still do this. So
Oh yeah.
one of the leaders of the Chinmaya mission that I know, who is not South Asian in ethnicity. When I talk to her, she says, "I'm not Hindu. I'm Advaita." So that's still, I think it's less common now that distinction is made. I mean, it's in most of the settings for these movements that I'm in, people do self-identify as Hindu, with the exception of transcendental meditation, which is the most sort of directly connected to the self-realization fellowship. That in that movement is still very common, less common than it used to be, but it's still quite common to have people who say, "I'm TM, I'm not Hindu."
Yeah.
But all the other
most of my I'm
yeah.
sorry,
No,
most
please.
of my guru buys, which is a term for someone who shares membership in a sampradaya. Most of my sampradaya of my guru buys would not identify as Hindu.
Right.
I'm the problem child.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so this also speaks to the complexity of Hinduism. I mean, the fact these movements, some of them at least, can sort of purport to, and in some cases, in fact, shed some of what we associate with Hinduism as a cultural reality, is part of what makes them interesting as missionary movements. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that surprised me in this conversation was to hear Fred recognize and acknowledge it's a question of definitions when it comes to mission. We hear that binary all the time: Christianity, missionary, Hinduism, not. And I run into members of other traditions too that think their tradition is not, it doesn't support evangelism. I've done pagan Christian dialogue. And again, I think it really comes to the question of definition, because in my experience, I think most people love their tradition and would like to see other people embrace it. And depending upon definition, that could be construed as a form of maybe soft evangelism or what. So can you touch on the question of definitions and why that's so important in this conversation?
Very important. And so in certain, from one level, the reason the book's called Hindu Mission, Christian Mission is that my whole response to the conversion controversy is to say we shouldn't talk about conversion unless we talk about mission. And we shouldn't identify them. Right? Conversion is one piece of the way Christians have talked about mission, but it's not the whole piece by any means, especially now. And so the fact that it was a term that Vivekananda was comfortable picking up and Chinmayananda was comfortable picking up, it seems to me speaks to its elasticity as a term, that it's not identified just with conversion. So, the people in the Ramakrishna mission, I don't think they're, by the way, I challenge whether they're correct about this, but they will say, we don't convert, but we are a missionary movement. We are missionaries without conversion. I don't think that's true, but of course it depends what you mean by conversion, right? That's part of, so that's a whole chapter of the book. So if you mean this, maybe that's true. If you mean this, it's not true, right? So definition matters, but I mean, I think that, so one of the inspirations for the book is a theologian named, I think is it Stephen Bosch? It's Bosch. He wrote a book called Paradigms of Mission.
David Bosch.
David Bosch. Thank you. I do this kind of thing all the time. I get
all right.
David Bosch. So he wrote this book called Paradigms of Mission. And that book is really important in the field of Christian missiology, because one of the things that it really historicized the way that Christians have thought about mission. And the historical fact is that Christians have not thought about mission in the same way. In the 16th century, the Catholics were very interested in sending missionaries on ships of discovery. Luther wasn't. Right. And there were some historically specific reasons why, right? Like that it had to do with sort of understanding mission. Even the word mission, I mean, one of the points that he makes is that the word mission, and in particular the use of the last few verses of Matthew as like the missionary mandate for Christians, which you'll hear very commonly now. It's not the way Christians have always talked about mission. That passage has not always been super important to Christians. I mean, it's in the Bible, so it's important, but it hasn't been the text that you use to talk about this. The person who really pioneered that was William Carey, who was a Baptist missionary in India, and then it sort of took hold, right? So one of the things that I think about ironically with this book is that William Carey and Swami Vivekananda are separated by about about 100 years, and maybe a day's walk. They're both in the area around Calcutta, and so I'm sitting here saying maybe the way that we think about mission is historically situated and really has its roots in a particular encounter in India that produced many Christian missions, but also produced these movements that I'm looking at. So the way that we try, again, that has to do with specifically the interpretation of Matthew, but we have to say that Christians have not always understood mission in the same way. There's been huge variation in the way that Christians have talked about mission, and so it's not surprising to me that it's a term that not all these movements call themselves missions, but several of them do. And it's not surprising to me that it's a term that they find has a kind of elasticity that they can use. And so that's why I think that it's a good comparative category. It is because, one of my teachers at Boston University, actually, Robert Neville, talked about comparison, and Wesley Wildman as well there. And their definition of a good comparative term is one that can include things that contradict each other in it, right? So fruit is a good compare. We talk about comparing apples and oranges. Well, they're both fruit, so fruit is a good comparative term. But there are characteristics of apples that contradict characteristics of oranges, right? Apples don't have a rind. And similarly, mission becomes, I think, a more useful term than conversion to use comparatively, because it does mean all these different things. And I detail in the book, I sort of detail 4 of them, and the 4 of them are experience, geography, social justice, or social engagement, and then conversion is the last one. But it's only one of the 4.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. Just one second, Fred, because in the evangelical tradition, there is this flattening of the idea of mission. Mission equals conversion. And
Right.
I've lost financial support from churches in the past because they see what I do and they say, basically, they're saying, what's the body count? What's the total number of conversions for the last year? And when I say that's not how I define success, for me, it's a process. It's an expansive process. So I hope that Christian listeners, particularly evangelicals, can pick up on the significance of what you're saying. Fred, sorry to cut you off there.
Oh, that's fine. Question for Reid. Are you familiar with the book, the Rutledge Anthology of Christian Hindu Experiences?
I think the Rutledge Anthology of Hindu-Christian Relations.
Yes.
I contributed to that, actually. If we're talking about the same book, I think it's Rutledge. Yeah.
Massively, massively thick.
Yeah. It's a huge book.
Yeah. Oh, I will look for your article.
Yeah.
I'm reading it right now in preparation for the upcoming dialogue with the bishops.
Right. No, it's a really important. I mean, not just because I contributed. I wrote about other things, right? I didn't actually write about missionary stuff there. I wrote about ritual. I think that's a really one of my colleagues here, Michelle Voss, was one of the co-editors of that, as well as Chad Bauman, who's written persuasively on anti-Christian violence in India. He's much more like, again, one of the things I say in the preface to the book is I was like, arguably the conversion controversy is a political question and a social question.
Very much so.
that a theologian is not going to solve. And so my little contribution to it is to say, but it's not non-theological, right? So theologians, we can't pretend to do everything, but we can do something.
Yep.
And so let's do our little piece.
Well, we've got less than 15 minutes left in our time together, and I want to at least get one more thing in that I really want Christian listeners and viewers to take away. You've got a great quote. I found all these wonderful quotes in your book, Reid. One was that you're encouraging Christians to think of themselves as practicing self-conscious witness as pilgrim or migrant rather than conqueror. I love that statement. If you could expand on that, and also tell us a little bit about, you also talk about, rather than Christian conversion, or you're talking about Christian conversion, thinking about it as Christification.
Christification, yeah.
Talk about those two things.
Sure, for sure. So in terms of the pilgrim and migrant, that really comes out of chapter 5 of the book. In that, I should say that in that chapter, I'm looking at the Chinmay mission and a form of hagiography of Shankara called the Vijaya literature, which is conquest literature, but it's also pilgrimage literature. And so I think that and even if you look at the Crusades in Christian history, I think the boundaries, the whole reason for the Crusades, people don't talk about it this way. They tend to take the early Crusades. I'm not defending the Crusades, but they tend to take the early Crusades through the lens of the later Crusades. But the earlier Crusades, technically, the pretext that was given was to protect pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land. And so the line between conquest and pilgrimage has always been a thin one. Precisely because it's a thin one, I think that we can sort of say that we do move, but we move in various ways, and we don't have to move as conquerors. We can move as pilgrims, and then also Gemma Cruz, I use her work, we can use as migrants. You know, that's actually the main way that many people are moving now. That's the main way that Hinduism came to North America, is through migration. Now, the movements that I studied the Vivekananda, the Vedanta Society was very much a missionary movement in its early years, in the sense that it mostly, recruited white settlers, right, to its ranks at that time. Now it's mostly South Asian. But that's the primary way that Hinduism has moved, is through migration, and I think that we can embrace that, and we can say, that's the way that Christianity probably came to the western coast of India, is through migrants who then sort of, there's a tradition around St. Thomas, and I don't want to discount that tradition, but by about the 4th century, there are waves of merchants who come and they witness to their faith in a way that's attractive, right? And so monasticism, especially Irish monasticism, had this tradition of peregrination. So the way you evangelize Europe, there was a Roman way, right? But there was also this Irish way. And the Irish way was you send out monks and they just walk around being Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And some people convert and some people don't, but that's what you're doing. That's how you're witnessing. And I think that's a way of witnessing that is very appropriate to our contemporary situation, is that we can wander around in a way that's deliberate without being, Machiavellian, right? To say, and I think that the Ramana Maharshi's tradition talks about, I was at an ashram and they talk about having outposts. I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about it as well, is that they say, we have an outpost of this beautiful revelatory experience, and we'll just plant ourselves and be neighbors, and people will find us.
And if I may,
yeah, please, and then I'll talk about Christification. Yeah,
real quick,
please.
Let's talk about, again, the differences when we talk about what is missionary activity, and one of the common things, common denominators of the various movements that have come to the United States, such as the Vedanta Society or Self-Realization Fellowship or TM, whatever, to a sampradaya, everyone will say, hey, if this is of interest to you, right, if you want to adopt the Advaita Vedanta understanding of theology, you can still be a Christian. We're not asking you to change your religion. Now, the challenge is that, at least in my mind, if a Christian all of a sudden adopts a Vedantic understanding of the universe and still maintains that he or she is a follower of Jesus, they are going to disrupt their personal theology in a major way, because I don't know how you can be Advaitin and a Christian in the traditional creedal sense,
right,
because you no longer need the sacrifice on the cross in the same way as Christianity tells us it is needed. So, for instance, Paramhansa Yogananda defines the miracle of the crucifixion in Jesus's absolute unconditional forgiveness, right, of everyone there. It's his death does not do anything, right, cosmological, right, right. So there is that part that says, no, you can be Christian You can still maintain Jesus as your guru or whatever you want to say, but you're decidedly walking out of the box of mainstream Christianity.
Yeah, and actually, that's actually a good illustration of what I mean by Christification, except in this case to the Advaita tradition. One of the analogies, and it's really problematic, I should say that this is, I mean, I think that sort of particularly Dalit and Adivasi readers of this book will find this the most problematic thing I do in the book. So is I revalorize a term that can be very, like conquest, can be quite dangerous, which is Sanskritization.
Mm-hmm.
But to talk about the purification, to think about conversion in terms of purification and ascent. And basically the short form of this is that these Advaitin traditions, I think have I don't think Christianity and Advaita are compatible. And at one point I went with my guru, I got very excited, and I came to him and I said, you and I both can't be right. We can both be wrong. That's logically possible. We could both be wrong. We could both be partly right and partly wrong, but we can't both be all right, about everything. And he was like, that's good that you see. And we had a wonderful conversation about it, and we were still open to each other, right?
And honestly, yeah. I don't know, because I know, for instance, I have several Christian, usually Catholic friends who are devotees of Father Richard Rohr.
For sure.
All right. And I love Rohr. Yeah. I love Father. Yeah. He's great. I have never been able to understand how they can fully embrace an Advaitin world theology,
right,
and still maintain that Jesus died for their sins.
Right. And so I would say that Christification is just the reverse of what Fred described in terms of Advaitin saying you don't have to become Advaitin, you don't have to become Hindu. You can just, you can adopt Advaita without becoming Hindu. And what I sort of propose, and again, this is not original. This is really building on something that was articulated by M.M. Thomas, who's one of these very ancient Christian lineages in India, to say that when Christians present Christ, they have kind of a all-encompassing ideal. And I'm actually conservative in this sense, right? So I'm a conservative Catholic in this sense. But there are many points of entry.
Mm-hmm.
And we shouldn't say that any point of entry is somehow inauthentic, right? So I have a colleague who studies, Carrie Sancherico studies Christ Bhaktas in Varanasi. And I think that we should say that that's an expression of Christianity, but it's without baptism, right? In most cases, it was without water baptism. And so I think that we could have a more capacious way that we talk about how we convert, and that there are many different ways in which that happens, and it's a much more complex reality. And if Christians embrace this in the way that Advaitins do, I think that, and I think arguably sometimes we do, we'd have a much more complex and interesting relationship in which we're engaged in a practice of mutual self-purification.
John, when we did our interview together, did I tell you about how Hindus are allowed to evangelize Mormons?
I don't recall if you did, but if you want to mention that real quickly, that would be fine.
Yeah,
that would be a good place to finish. Yeah.
It has nothing to do with theology. We just know they are the best tithers. So, we love them. I'm kidding, of course. We don't evangelize.
But just to summarize what I said, Christification simply says that what Christians claim is to remake the world in Christ.
Yes.
And what I'm arguing for the book is a much more capacious understanding of how that looks in life.
Wonderful. Well, we were at the end of the conversation. I feel like we just barely
scratched the
surface. Yeah. But the bell is ringing. It's time to get back to class. But I'm so glad to have discovered your book and your work, Reid and Fred. It was wonderful to bring in your perspective and that conversational aspect. So my thanks to both of you for being here today.
Really grateful to have this chance to talk with both of you. Thank you.
It was wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation, John.
And again, my guests have been Reid Locklin. He's the author of the book, Hindu Mission, Christian Mission, Soundings in Comparative Theology, and Fred Stella. And you can find the bios for these gentlemen and a link to Reid's new book in the program notes. And if you stay to the very end of this podcast, you'll see a link or a couple of links, one to my prior conversation with Fred and a conversation in another podcast with a representative of the Hare Krishna organization.
Oh, yeah,
So
great.
if you want to pursue these topics, we've had other conversations as well. Again, thanks to everybody for watching and listening. This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast.